What about technical? Okay. I welcome all to this event on the right of self-determination day. Ladies and gentlemen, we are observing 5th of January as right to self-determination day for the Kashmiris. This is the day to renew and reiterate our commitment to uphold the fundamental human rights of the people of Jammu and Kashmir and pay homage to Kashmiris' just struggle spanning more than 7 decades. On this day in 1949, the United Nations Commission on India and Pakistan adopted a resolution. It was a historic resolution. It was the resolution that enshrined the most durable solution of Jammu and Kashmir dispute. It gave a pledge to Kashmiri people on behalf of the international community. It assured Kashmiri people on behalf of the international community that they will get their inherent right to self-determination through a free and impartial plebiscite in Jammu and Kashmir. After 73 years of the adoption of resolution, people in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir are facing extraordinary military siege. The Indian actions in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir contradict the UN Security Council resolutions, bilateral agreements, and international law. Kashmiris have been facing the oppressive measures and the denial of their rights by India for more than 73 years. Today, on the Right to Self-Determination Day, we are here to express our full support for the Kashmiris' right to self-determination. No doubt, it's a panel of distinguished scholars, activists, and opinion makers. I shall introduce each of them at the time of giving them floor. The human rights situation in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir is in its worst phase by any standards, particularly due to extrajudicial killings, fake encounters, enforced disappearances, the indiscriminate use of pellet guns, illegal detention of innocent people. For millions of Kashmiris, their own homes have been declared prisons by more than 900,000 occupation troops. The Indian effort to change the demographic structure of Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir exposes the Indian ambition to make the Muslim majority into a minority in that region. India is implementing these changes through illegal domicile rules and by the introduction of new property laws. India is offering incentives to outsiders to facilitate their settlements on the occupied land of Kashmir in violation of international law, particularly the Fourth Geneva Convention. We shall discuss various aspects of all these issues today. I shall request all panelists to restrict their interventions to 10 minutes. Without much ado now, I shall invite Acting High Commissioner Shahbaz Malik Saab to read messages of Pakistan's leadership. Acting High Commissioner Shahbaz Malik is one of the senior diplomats in Foreign Service of Pakistan with more than 20 years of experience. He has served in Pakistan embassies in Nairobi, Tashkent, and Seoul. Over to Acting High Commissioner Shahbaz Malik.
In the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful. Thank you very much, sir, for the kind introduction. At the outset, I would like to thank all of the worthy participants and would also like to acknowledge the efforts of our Consul General, Mr. Abdul Hameed for arranging this webinar. Without much further ado, I will read out the message from Dr. Arif Alvi, President of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, on the occasion of Right of Self-Determination Day, 5th January 2022. Quote, on 5th January 1949, United Nations Commission on India and Pakistan, UNCIP, adopted a resolution guaranteeing a free and impartial plebiscite in Jammu and Kashmir. Today marks 73rd anniversary of the United Nations commitment that the Jammu and Kashmir dispute would be decided through the democratic method of a free and impartial plebiscite under the UN auspices. Kashmiris around the world are observing this Right to Self-Determination Day to make the international community realize that their promise to the people of Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, IIOJK, remains unfulfilled. In these difficult 7 decades, 3 generations of Kashmiris have suffered at the hands of Indian occupation forces, waiting for the actualization of UN's promise to them. Despite lapse of 7 decades, Jammu and Kashmir dispute remains unresolved due to India's obstinate refusal to honor its commitments and its disrespect for the fundamental human rights and international law. Since August 5, 2019, through a number of illegal and unilateral steps, India has created an environment of fear and chaos in IIOJK. India has promulgated new domicile rules and introduced amendments in land ownership laws to alter the demographic structure of the occupied territory in clear violation of the international law, including the UN Charter, relevant UN Security Council resolutions, and the Fourth Geneva Convention. With the pandemic situation, the Kashmiris are faced with double lockdown in IIOJK. The lockdown and the COVID-19 pandemic are estimated to have cost around US $9.5 billion to the economy of IIOJK. Indian occupation forces have intensified repression of the Kashmiris through surge in extrajudicial killings, fake encounters, arbitrary detention of Kashmiri journalists and human rights defenders, communications blackouts, incarceration of Kashmiri political leaders, violent suppression of peaceful Kashmiri protests, use of pellet guns, and demolition of entire neighborhoods and villages as collective punishment. No amount of Indian attempts will succeed in misleading the international community and glossing over India's state terrorism being perpetrated with shameless impunity in IIOJK. Nor could use of brutal force ever succeed in breaking the will of the Kashmiri people in their just and legitimate struggle. Pakistan calls upon the international community to hold India accountable for the egregious human rights violations in IIOJK and to play its role for peaceful and durable resolution of the Kashmir and Jammu dispute. Pakistan, on its part, will continue to extend all possible support to the Kashmiri people until they realize their legitimate and inalienable right to self-determination in accordance with the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. Unquote. Now I will read the message of the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Mr. Imran Khan, on the occasion of Right to Self-Determination Day, 5th January 2022. Quote, while observing 5th of January as Right to Self-Determination Day for the Kashmiris, we reiterate our commitment to uphold the fundamental human rights of the people of Jammu and Kashmir and pay homage to Kashmiris' just struggle spanning more than 7 decades. On this day in 1949, the United Nations Commission on India and Pakistan, UNCIP, adopted a resolution which guaranteed Kashmiri people their inherent right to self-determination through a free and impartial plebiscite in Jammu and Kashmir. We are commemorating this day to remind the world community that it cannot abandon its moral and legal responsibilities towards the Kashmiri people. The importance of the inalienable right to self-determination has been acknowledged in all important human rights covenants, decisions of the United Nations General Assembly and the Security Council. The right to self-determination was granted to the Kashmiris by the United Nations and cannot be unilaterally denied by India. 3 generations of Kashmiris have waited for the world community and the United Nations to honor their solemn commitments made to Kashmiris. Indian atrocities in IIOJK continue unabated, but the courage and spirit of Kashmiris remains strong. With the presence of 900,000 troops, India has turned the occupied territory into the largest open-air prison and the most militarized zone in the world. The recent surge in the oppression of the people of IIOJK through arbitrary detentions, coercion, harassment and humiliation, and extrajudicial killings in staged encounters and cordon and search operations is a matter of grave concern for the international community. India's illegal and unilateral actions of 5th August 2019 and subsequent measures, particularly pertaining to domicile rules and land ownership laws, are aimed at changing the demographic structure of IIOJK and converting the Kashmiris into a minority in their own land. These Indian actions are blatant violation of the international law, especially the UN Charter, UN Security Council resolutions, and the Fourth Geneva Convention. Kashmiris have been deprived of their rights to life, food, health, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, and above all, the freedom to right self-determination. Pakistan calls upon the international community to demand from India an immediate end to its state terrorism against Kashmiris and allow access to international human rights and humanitarian organizations to the occupied territory. Durable peace in South Asia is contingent upon peaceful resolution of the Jammu and Kashmir dispute in accordance with the international legitimacy. Pakistan will continue to extend all possible support to the Kashmiris till the realization of their inalienable right to self determination and a just resolution of the Jammu and Kashmir dispute in accordance with the relevant UNSC resolutions and the wishes of the Kashmiri people. Unquote. The last message is from the Foreign Minister, Mr. Maktoum Shah Mahmood Qureshi, on this occasion. Quote, today marks the completion of 73 years since the United Nations committed that the Jammu and Kashmir dispute would be decided through the democratic method of a free and impartial plebiscite. Through its resolution of 5th January 1949, the United Nations Security Council affirmed its support to the realization of inalienable right to the self-determination of Kashmiris. Self-determination is one of the fundamental rights codified in all major human rights instruments as well as the United Nations Charter. The denial of this right and subjugation of Kashmiris in IIOJK is negation of human dignity. Unfortunately, this right has not been realized for Kashmiris because of continuing oppression by India in the Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, IIOJK. In the last 7 decades, 3 generations of Kashmiris have rendered tremendous sacrifices for their just struggle, yet their human dignity is being violated on a daily basis in IIOJK. Since its illegal and unilateral actions of 5th August 2019, India has been relentlessly pursuing further consolidation of its illegal military occupation, including through land confiscation, influx of non-Kashmiris, and creation of alien settlements in IIOJK in flagrant violations of international law, especially the UN Charter, relevant UNSC resolutions, and the Fourth Geneva Convention. The surge in fake encounters and so-called cordon and search operations has resulted in the martyrdom of over 500 Kashmiris since 5th August 2019. This is abhorrent manifestation of the callous behavior and moral bankruptcy of BJP and RSS combined. India must realize that use of brutal force against the Kashmiri people, including extrajudicial killings, custodial torture, enforced disappearances, incarceration of Kashmiri leadership, and use of pellet guns, destruction of houses to inflict collective punishment on the Kashmiri communities, and other methods of subjugation have failed in the past and will not succeed in the future. The indigenous resistance movement of the Kashmiris for their inalienable right to self-determination, as enshrined in the relevant UN Security Council resolutions, will only become stronger in the face of Indian state terrorism. Pakistan calls upon the international community, including the United Nations, human rights organizations, and the global media, to take full cognizance of the aggravating situation in IIOJK and hold India accountable for egregious human rights violations and serious crimes against humanity in the occupied territory. The international community must act in support of the fundamental freedoms and basic human rights of Kashmiris. The United Nations must live up to its promise of granting right to self-determination to Kashmiris. It must urge India to allow UN fact-finding mission to IIOJK to investigate the reports of grave human rights violations there. Pakistan remains fully supportive of and stands in solidarity with its Kashmiri brothers and sisters. We will continue to extend all possible support to the Kashmiris till the realization of their inalienable right to self-determination in accordance with the UNSC resolutions and the wishes of the Kashmiri people. Unquote. Thank you.
Thank you, Acting High Commissioner. Now I invite Karen Rodman. She is a retired civil servant and currently serves as Director Just Peace Advocates. She has 30 years of experience in public policy. She is a founder and CEO of Just Trade. She visited AJK in 2019. Over to Karen Rodman.
Shukriya. Assalamu alaikum. I'm joining you tonight from Kawartha Lakes on 1818 Treaty 20 land that is the indigenous home of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, and the Wendat people. As we consider colonization in Indian-occupied Kashmir, we remember too that Canada was founded on and continues to be party to ongoing violence against the Indigenous people of Turtle Island. Thank you so much for including me this evening as we consider our 73 years of broken international promises for the people of Kashmir. On December 31st, 1947, India brought the matter of Kashmir to the United Nations. On January 20th, 1948, under the United Nations Security Council Resolution 39, the United Nations Commission for India and Pakistan was formed. And following this, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 47 on the 21st of April, 1948. Resolution 47 laid the basis for the resolve of the Kashmir issue. Canada very much had its fingerprints on this resolution, with Canada's then United Nations representative, Ambassador Andrew McNaughton, being also the president of the United Nations Security Council. Then on January 5th, 1949, as we've been talking about, the implementation plans for Kashmir's self-determination were put in place by a resolution of the United Nations Commission for India and Pakistan. On January 5th, 1949, direction of the United Nations Commission for India and Pakistan laid out a detailed plan that both India and Pakistan had already accepted ahead of that time. It provided details for a free and impartial plebiscite that had been promised in the United Nations Security Resolution 47, and it included details to free right of return with provisions to exercise rights as citizens for those returning. It also provided for freedom of the press, speech, and assembly, and for freedom of travel in the state, including freedom of lawful entry and exit. It also called for the release of all political prisoners. It would have seemed reasonable to be optimistic at that time that the people of Jammu and Kashmir indeed would have their right to self-determination recognized through the plebiscite promised to them in Resolution 47. Of course, just as in the case of Palestine, the forces of imperialism and colonization were at play, even in what was described at the time as a post-colonial world, a world that had its hopes very much pinned on the shiny new institution of the United Nations. So here we are, humbly, here we are, 73 years later. Jammu and Kashmir remain an internationally recognized disputed territory. On March 31st, 2020, amid the panic of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Indian government introduced the Domicile Law, the law that has been aimed at demographic change and at taking the land and resources from the indigenous population of Jammu and Kashmir and transferring the occupier's own population into the area. The law is counter to the United Nations Security Council Resolution 47 and to a subsequent 5 United Nations security resolutions that were passed during the 1950s that called for a plebiscite to determine the future of the disputed area. Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention states, the occupying power shall not transfer its own civilian population into a territory it occupies. And bringing that closer to home, under Article 1, all high contracting parties, which includes Canada, are required to take action to ensure respect for the convention in all circumstances. So when we do not do that, we too are complicit with those violations. Over these last 2 years, settler colonization of Kashmir has been in hyperdrive behind a veil of silence through communication blockages and a world focused on COVID, domestically. The demographic change is well underway through the issuing of at least 4 million domicile certificates, while terror and fear are used to silence the Kashmiri population. This fall, during the Canadian election, the questions were asked of all parties, of candidates of all parties related to Kashmir. The Bloc Quebec was the only party that responded, indicating that they would support a parliamentary motion to hold the Indian government accountable. Several candidates from the New Democratic Party and the Green Party also indicated understanding of the human rights and international law violations by India of the indigenous Kashmiri people. This was very much intended to be a campaign that provided tools so people could talk with their local candidates about Kashmir during the election. After the election, all elected officials were also provided with information about Kashmir and asked those same questions. More recently, on November 22nd, leading global human rights defender Karam Perez was arrested at his residence in Srinagar following a raid at that residence and also at his offices, the Jammu Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society. This arbitrary detention has garnered much coverage across the world because of his stance as a human rights defender. It's been condemned by UN experts, by mainline media, by human rights organizations, and by personalities such as Roger Waters. In Canada, almost 2,000 letters have been sent to all elected officials in this regard. Again, the hope is that we can work through civil society to increase the awareness of our Canadian members of Parliament about the situation. It is an honor to be able to work together with Kashmiri and solidarity organizations here in Canada and around the world in our joint work to shine a light on the truth about the history and the present of Kashmir. As we near 3/4 of a century of broken international promises, may we work to make this light brighter, holding our governments, our media, corporations, and other institutional decision makers accountable so the promise made on January 5th, 1949 for self-determination can be realized for the people of Kashmir. Shukriya and salam.
Thank you very much. Very apt statement. Now I invite Dr. Zafar Bang. Okay. I would again say I invite Dr. Zafar Bangesh, Director, Institute of Contemporary Islamic Thought. He is a founding member of Friends of Kashmir Committee. He is the author of several books. Over to Dr. Bangesh.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, and a welcome to my fellow Canadians as well, Karen, Robert, Phil, longtime associates in struggle for justice and peace in the world. And of course, thanks to the Acting High Commissioner, Mr. Shahbaz Malik, as well as to Consul General, Mr. Abdul Hameed. In the Kashmiris' long history of struggle, there are very many grim milestones, but January 5th actually offers a ray of hope, in the sense that it was on January 5th, 1949, when the United Nations Commission for India and Pakistan passed this resolution. And of course, this commission was established by the United Nations Security Council to look into the situation in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And this resolution that was passed on January 5th provided the legal basis for the future settlement of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, which was basically, or in essence, categorically stated that there should be a referendum or a plebiscite held in Jammu and Kashmir to determine the wishes of the people, to ascertain as to whether they wish to become part of Pakistan or wish to remain in India. Now we need to step back a little bit and reflect on the events of October of 1947, when Indian troops illegally invaded and occupied large parts of Jammu and Kashmir. India's excuse that they advanced at the time was that their forces had landed in Srinagar at the invitation of the Maharaja Hari Singh, but the ruler, who was a tyrannical ruler, had already fled the state in the face of an uprising by the people of Jammu and Kashmir. And so this Maharaja really had no legal, moral, or political authority to invite Indian occupation forces into the state of Jammu and Kashmir. In any case, as pointed out by Alistair Lamb, the British author, nobody has actually seen this so-called instrument of accession. So it seems as if that was just an excuse or a ruse used by India in connivance, unfortunately, with the British, that the Indian forces invaded the state of Jammu and Kashmir. As Karen pointed out, it was India that took the matter to the UN Security Council, and therefore India is obliged under its own actions to abide by the resolutions of the Security Council, of which there are at least 12 that call for a referendum in Jammu and Kashmir. I want to mention two other aspects as well. And the first is that when the Indian forces landed in Jammu and Kashmir on October 27th, 1947, according to British media reports, they perpetrated a horrible massacre in Jammu, in which an estimated 350,000 or more Kashmiris were slaughtered, and an equal number of Kashmiris were pushed out of that region into what is Pakistan. So within a matter of a few days, the demographic composition of Jammu, which was a predominantly Muslim area, constituting something like 61% of the population, was reduced to a minority in at least one region of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And similar moves are underway in the Kashmir Valley today, where demographic changes are underway in order to turn the indigenous Kashmiri people into a minority. Of course, this is something that we need to not only condemn, but to draw the attention of the global community so that the rights of the Kashmiri people are not violated in such a blatant manner. Another aspect that I think we need to keep in mind, and that is that soon after the Second World War, when the United Nations came into existence, a number of countries starting from that time all the way up to the 60s gained independence. So immediately after the Second World War, because of the bloodletting in Europe, where many of these European colonial powers had been weakened and they could no longer continue to hold on to their colonial possessions in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, a number of countries emerged. So in 1945, there were 73 members of the United Nations. Today, there are 193. That means in the intervening period, 120 countries gained independence. Regrettably, in two regions of the world, Kashmir and Palestine, exactly the opposite happened. Again, unfortunately, with British intrigue. So in Kashmir, the British and the Indians connived in order to deprive the people of Jammu and Kashmir of their inalienable right to choose their own destiny. In Palestine as well, in fact, in a much worse way, that in Palestine, through the connivance of the United Nations General Assembly, the alien invaders were allowed to settle into Palestine against the wishes of the indigenous people. In case of the issue of Jammu and Kashmir, at least there are Security Council resolutions that call for a referendum in that state so that the people can determine their own future. Now, the question is, why is it that the United Nations, that represents the will of 193 countries today, is unable to get the right of self-determination to the people of Jammu and Kashmir that lies on its own statute books? Unfortunately, the reality is that while on the moral basis and on the legal basis, the people of Jammu and Kashmir have both on their side, in terms of global politics, regrettably, the world does not operate on the basis of right. It operates on the basis of might and self-interest. And that is the tragedy that we face today. We also face this situation in Canada, where, as was pointed out by Karen, that a Canadian diplomat, Andrew McNaughton, was the one who maneuvered this resolution in the Security Council for the right of self-determination of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. In our interactions with Canadian elected representatives, we have communicated the issue of Jammu and Kashmir in very clear terms to them. We have held meetings with many of them, but regrettably, they are unwilling to take a public stand against India and to support their own stated policy of the right of self-determination of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. What we, those of us who are Canadian citizens and residing here in Canada, we have an obligation to engage with the civil society groups, to bring them on board, to sensitize them to this issue. And I can say that we have had considerable success in this respect. The panelists that are present today are a testimony to this. We need to develop that pressure from the ground up so that we can pressurize our elected representatives to take a stand on the matter of principle, which is a principle of self-determination, which is enshrined in the UN Charter as well as the International Human Rights Declaration. As we speak, there are in fact 2 genocide watches, active genocide watches relating to Kashmir. As we speak, there are 2 detailed reports issued by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, one in the year 2018, the second one in 2019, and even subsequently. Based with all of this information, it should be logical to expect that the elected representatives in Canada would support the right of self-determination of the people of Jammu and Kashmir, and that they ought to be upfront. But regrettably, we do not find that. So what we have to do is, as I mentioned, we have to continue to work with civil society groups to build up that ground pressure, that public pressure from the community, so that we will impress upon our elected representatives that they ought to take the issue of Jammu and Kashmir seriously, and to allow the people of Jammu and Kashmir to hold that referendum so that they can determine their own future. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you, Dr. Bangash. Now I invite Mr. Phil Taylor. His radio program, Taylor Report, carries regular features on South Asia. His radio journalism is known for informed analysis. Over to Mr. Taylor. Please unmute yourself, Mr. Taylor.
You missed my speech. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. I'm very grateful that to be part of a distinguished panel. It is, I think, an accomplishment that we, again, are having an event such as this. I've participated in some previous And I want to, by the way, call out to everyone's attention the really zealous work of Brother Zafar Bengash, who has been the leading voice and certainly has total command, as the lawyers say, of the file on this matter. And I've never felt discussing this that I would be wrong-footed by any opponent, because Zafar has always been so thorough and so principled in stating the case, and as so far the other panelists. There's a proverb that long will the bitter morsel be chewed, and here we are. We already have the solution. We had a United Nations resolution. And all these years later, the people of Kashmir have to suffer the presence of an immense army. I've always been staggered at the figures of 900,000 Indian troops. To do what? To deprive a people of their right to self-determination, to take from them the right to a plebiscite, which was promised to them by the United Nations. It is indeed a bitter morsel, but I do think that it is evident that you cannot carry on all these years denying something which you asked for, as in this case, India. There's a joke that someone said that this man is so stubborn and so ignorant, he won't take yes for an answer. India asked for this. The answer was yes. And then they decided they didn't want to ask that anymore. So we're talking about someone or a state that is in a rather pathetic situation, because they themselves put their finger on the solution, and the solution will remain. It cannot be chased away by troops. It cannot be, you cannot sit on a people for all these years without educating them totally to their need to exercise their rights. I've said in the past, I believe that the Kashmiri people already enjoy in their hearts freedom, because they've indicated what it is they want, and all that is left to the world is to live up to the United Nations Charter. And that, you could say, is the rub. And as Brother Zafar pointed out, we are up against great power arrogance, which believes it can turn away its face to a problem and that the problem will go away. Actually, what's going to happen is that the people of Kashmir will be free. They will exercise their right to self-determination. And those powers that are standing in their way will be lesser powers as a result of having stood in their way. Now, recently, early December, President Biden he put together a conference he called the Summit for Democracy. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity for us to say to the Canadian people and to the Western powers, you want to have a summit for democracy, you want to renew humanity's struggle for freedom, let's begin with Kashmir. Let us see that this happens. I think that they have, again, like India, they've talked themselves into a corner. The world's people are ready for democracy. Up and down the hemisphere we live in, there's been election after election now in formerly colonized countries where they are asserting themselves in a democratic manner, electing presidents, electing congresses, but all of them are successful because they are asserting their sovereignty as people over and against the old colonial system. We are living where we have a UN charter, which protects all these rights. And then we have narrow-minded, bigoted, great powers which are trying to block. But that democracy they wanted to have a summit about is unfolding. And I'm confident that we're going to reach a time in a not distant future where those countries are going to be affirming to the people of Kashmir, yes, you have to have a plebiscite. The 900,000 soldiers must be removed from Kashmir. Again, that's in writing. We're not making this up. Those 900,000 will have to be away when the people assert their democratic rights. And I agree with Karen. I wanted to say, and others actually mentioned his name, but Canadians have to be told over and over. General MacNaughton, probably the most respected military figure in the history of Canada, and certainly was turned into a marvelous diplomat. Generals don't usually turn into good diplomats, but he was a wonderful diplomat. And his contribution really began with respect for the people of Kashmir and for Pakistan, because he saw the parties as equal, which was kind of a surprise to people. And Canada at one time followed that model, where it was understood that sovereign countries are equal, that freedom is indivisible, that people are addressed with respect, and that peace can be achieved if you do that. And General MacNaughton played a really outstanding role. There ought to be a statue of him in Ottawa and Toronto and Montreal, elsewhere, just because he helped put us on the road to solving this issue of the self-determination of Kashmir. I would just remind everyone something that I always keep in my head that Victor Hugo said, nothing can stop nothing can stop an idea whose time has come. And the idea of self-determination and democracy for the people of Kashmir, that time has come. And lastly, another great president of our hemisphere, President Juarez of Mexico, said, with mutual respect, you have peace. And the people of Kashmir have to be respected. And it's written there in the UN resolution. Let us respect it and proceed democracy with democracy for peace in Kashmir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Taylor. Wonderfully put. We need to respect people, and we need to respect people of Kashmir. And time for the idea of Kashmiri's freedom has come. The amazing ideas. Now I invite Mr. Robert Fentina. He's the author of several books. As a journalist, he has been a regular contributor to several journals, including Counterpunch, Mint Press News, Middle East Rising, Palestine News Network, and The Truther. He has been interviewed by various TV channels in different parts of the world. He is a member of the World Beyond War and a board member of Canadians for Peace and Justice in Kashmir and Canadian Voices for Justice in Palestine. Over to Mr. Fentina.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here with this distinguished group. Our efforts on behalf of the Kashmiri people must not cease. We need to pressure our own governments to end the oppression of the Kashmiri people. As Mr. Taylor said, mutual respect brings peace. And certainly we don't see that. We don't see the Indian government respecting the Kashmiri people at all. I'd like to start with my remarks with some of the specific points of UN Resolution 47. In the interest of time, I'll only mention a few. And as it has been mentioned by other speakers today, India agreed to each of these points. Key components are as follows. Number 7, the government of India should undertake that there will be established in Jammu and Kashmir a plebiscite administration to hold a plebiscite as soon as possible on the question of the accession of the state of India or of the state to India or Pakistan. So this commitment couldn't be clearer. India agreed that the people of Kashmir had the right to decide their own future. The 8th point was that the government of India should undertake that there will be delegated by the state to the plebiscite administration such power as the latter considers necessary holding a fair and impartial plebiscite. And again, this was agreed to by India, but has never been enforced. And the current behaviors of the Indian government indicate that it never will be, at least if it's up to India. It seems that India and the government of India has never really respected or intended to respect this resolution. In the publication in India Quarterly, going back to 2001, Professor R.S. Sane set forth Indian policy on self-determination. Early in the remarks, he states clearly his opinion that, quote, much of the civil strife throughout the world is due to the realization of the so-called right to self-determination. Now, this indicates certainly that, he sees self-determination as causing civil strife, not as something that is universally accepted as a basic human right of all people. Now, more recently, on November 16th of 2019, just a couple of months after the rescinding of the various articles that to India's constitution, Sandy Chakravorty, who was India's Consul General to New York City, was visiting New York. And in a speech, he said the following regarding Kashmir, quote, I believe the security situation will improve, and in your lifetime, you will be able to go back because you already have a model in the world. I don't know why we don't follow it. It has happened in the Middle East. If the Israeli people can do it, we can also do it, close quote. So obviously the government of India plans to, or planned at that time and is now implementing a settler colonial project in Kashmir. I believe Karen mentioned the huge numbers of people, of Hindus that have been invited to relocate into Kashmir to buy property there. The purpose, of course, being to reduce the Muslim majority population to a minority, making the people of Kashmir, Kashmiri peoples, second-class citizens in their own country. I'd like also to refer to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I'm going to mention several articles from that. Article 3 reads this: everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Close quote. Today, the Indian government says it's fighting terrorism. And by doing that, it's perpetrating illegal detentions, torture, sexual violence, expropriation of land, collective punishment, and so on. This is going on in the cities and in the towns, in remote areas where Kashmiris have lived for generations on farms. Apple trees, hundreds of apple trees on personal property are being cut down, depriving them of a livelihood. The idea is, of course, to impoverish them, to repress them in any way possible. Article 5 says that no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Now, over 30 years ago, India passed what it called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. It's legislation that provides the military with absolute control over the Kashmiri people. According to the AFSPA, Armed Forces Special Powers Act, the following violations of international law and crimes against humanity are, quote, legalized: arbitrary arrests and detention, rape, disappearances, extrajudicial executions. So this is another way that the Indian government works to oppress the Kashmiri people in the most violent ways possible. Article 9 reads that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. Now this, of course, these arbitrary arrests have been the norm for decades. They've increased correspondingly with the increase in the number of Indian soldiers now in the country. 8 million Kashmiris have become prisoners in their own homes, with more than 900,000 occupation troops holding them hostage. There are few examples of history of such a violation of human rights. Thousands of Kashmiris have been arbitrarily detained. Kashmiri youth in particular are being targeted through abductions, incarceration at undisclosed locations, and indiscriminate use of pellet guns and extrajudicial killings. This is more manifestations of Indian state terrorism against Kashmiris. Crimes against the Kashmiris by the Indian government are happening on a daily basis. These are crimes against humanity, major violations of international law. The people of Kashmir are suffering because they have not been able to have they've been deprived of the right of self-determination. Today, we are commemorating that right. We are reinforcing it. We are saying that we will not allow the Indian government to deprive the people of Kashmir of this basic human right. It has been enshrined in international law repeatedly, not just in 1949, but since then, that has been renewed. The Indian government has agreed to it, and yet the Indian government refuses to allow it and is now making, as I mentioned before, the people of Kashmir second-class citizens in their own country. During the administration of Donald Trump, he agreed with the Indian government's completely false and dishonest statement that the issue of Kashmir is an internal one. The United States government has influence in the world, and Trump's statement was completely unhelpful for the people of Kashmir. We need to oppose that in every sphere. As has been mentioned before, I'm a resident of Canada, but I hold citizenship in both Canada and the United States. So I need to work in both nations to support the people of Kashmir in whatever way I can. It's long past time for the suffering of the Kashmiri people to cease. And we here today, and the people who will join with us in the future, must work so that the suffering can cease, and so that the people of Kashmir will be able to determine for themselves what form of government they want and be able to live in peace, freedom, and security. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fantina. I must say that you have rightly pointed out that there have been very few examples of human rights violation at such a scale in modern human history. Thank you very much for your statement. It was clear in the discussion of today that there is an urgent need for an immediate implementation of UN Security Council resolutions, as well as repealing of India's illegal and unilateral actions in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. All illegally arrested Kashmiris must be released, and all such laws that provide impunity to Indian occupation forces must be repealed. The international human rights and humanitarian organizations, as well as the international media, should be allowed access to investigate the grave human rights situation in the occupied territory. India must adhere to its international human rights obligations and honor the commitment to grant to Kashmiris their inalienable right to self-determination through a free and impartial plebiscite under the UN auspices. I thank all of you for sharing your views and sparing time for this event. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.